thank you so much for being here. And yeah.
Okay. So I don't know if you can see me or just, well, you can see my picture there anyway, but yeah, as Carolina said, I'm Matthew Pye. I'm a teacher in Brussels. I teach philosophy, and in my spare time, I do books and climate stuff, of which Carolina was part of the academy before she went to Warwick. So first of all, thank you for this space to talk to everybody. These are strange times, and I'm sure that after I got some feedback from Birgit and Michael and from Carolina about Michael Wadley's talk that you had before. So I'm kind of privileged to be part of that sequence. So thank you for the space. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, sorry, the delay was my camera. We got some. So yeah, and again. So yeah, the people that made this possible really are Michael there that you talked to previously, and Birgit. Just extraordinary people, both in terms of their vision of climate change and from kind of the highest narratives about the problem to the granular detail of the science. So they're just amazing Homo sapiens, and it's thanks to them that I understand anything about climate. I was ignorant about anything about 10 years ago, and I went to a talk that Michael gave on sustainability and resource depletion, and I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that I'd missed that reality and that I'd only bumped into it by chance. And since then, Michael and Birgit have worked closely with me and with students trying to bring this reality to the surface. And also Hans there, my very dear friend Hans, who made the book possible with his generosity and also his Vedic insights. But I don't have time for Vedic insights today. We're going to talk about Plato. So there you go. That's why I'm able to be here and to talk to you. And of course, my day job is talking about philosophy. So if you go to the next slide, I'll introduce you to what that is. So, of course, it's a bit of an odd talk, you know. The guy on the left there with a funny old beard and a kind of stone-looking face. And on the right, there's some kind of diagram. And philosophy might be a bit intimidating to some people. I was in Manchester once opening a bank account, and they were asking me, you know, what's your name, what's your date of birth, what's your job? And I said teacher, and they kind of pressed me a bit more because it was a bit awkward silence. So I eventually said, well, I'm a philosophy teacher. And then she said, oh, that's fantastic. I love dinosaurs too. So I understand that philosophy is either something just a bit odd or a bit mysterious or whatever. So I'm going to, first, before we even start talking about Plato and climate change, I'll just explain a little bit about what philosophy is and in a sense what the book is. So the book Plato Tackles Climate Change performs, if you like, as my lessons work in the classroom. So you can see on the right there's a triangle, and there are 3 points to the triangle. And if we just start in the bottom right-hand corner where it says experience, that's you. I mean, that's me. That's just your everyday life. And some people are naturally reflective, others are less so. But sometimes the world just confronts you and kind of shocks you, either through its beauty or through its tragedy. And that drags you away from your own experience. It kind of creates a gap between just the everyday life and what on earth is going on. But there's a kind of shortcut. You don't have to wait for those extraordinary moments of life. There's a shortcut. So just go back to having this extra vision on things, and that is to read a book of philosophy, because philosophers can lift the lid on what is going on. They can lift the lid on life and show it in 3, 4, 5, 6 dimensions. So the exercise of philosophy is to drag you away from your normal everyday experience and to show it in a way which is deeper, richer, more complex, more, you know, full of ambiguities and so on. So in a way, philosophy pulls you into the middle of that triangle, and then you can look back at your own experience, you can look back at yourself, and see yourself in a completely different way. So philosophy has got, it's all of those things. Philosophy is not the book. Philosophy is not finding out what Plato said and all of that. That's part of it. But you have to have this open, reflective mind. You have to have a heart and a mind that's open for philosophy to do its work. So in that sense, it's a bit scary, but in another sense, it's just very down to earth. You just have to be open-minded. So that's what a book of philosophy is supposed to do. That's what I think a classroom of philosophy is supposed to do. So welcome to my little classroom for 40 minutes. On the left, then, you have Plato, and he's an extraordinary guy. I mean, he's the father. He has the right to claim that he's the father of Western philosophy. But from his image, it wouldn't be obvious that he was such an extraordinary man. I'll just give you a sketch of his life, and then, of course, as we go through, little things will become obvious. So, as a young man, he saw his teacher die. His teacher was executed with a cup of hemlock. His teacher was Socrates, and Socrates had just asked too many questions for comfort to the Athenians. He'd gone around, Socrates, his teacher, had gone around the Agora in ancient Athens and asked questions about reality, about truth, about justice. And in the end, he'd just been a bit too annoying or too threatening. I sympathise with those who just say he was a bit annoying, but at the same time, he was also after something noble. So he experienced tragedy in his life, a second time, in fact, because, again, in his young years, Athens went to war with Sparta, and there was no signal for the Athenians to think that they would lose this war. They had the most awesome navy, and okay, we're going up against the Spartans, which, if you've seen the film, any film with Spartans in it, you know that they've got good muscles. So it was going to be some kind of battle, but there was nothing really to suggest to the Athenians, with their pride in being Athenian, that they were going to lose, but they did, and they lost catastrophically. So this moment in the Athenian psyche, I suppose, is a bit like 9/11 for an American, or World War I for Western culture. And it really broke their expectations in a deep way about what was true, what was real, what was right. And Plato, as a young man, would have gone through that tragedy. Okay, so we mustn't think of Plato as some kind of abstract, aloof philosopher who's got nothing to say to us. He was a young man that struggled with democracy, because democracy had voted to kill Socrates, democracy had voted to go to war with Sparta, and so he was struggling with injustice and the stupidity of democratic rule. Okay, so when we look at climate change, we look at it, I guess, most of us are probably listening to this from somewhere in Europe, from within democracies, which have a great nobility. We have technical progress. You know, Athens was an extraordinary place. Ancient Athens was just one of those like golden moments of Western culture, and yet it was also capable of crass stupidity. And I think that's a good reason why Plato can talk to us about climate change, and that's why we can do the. So, here's the next slide. So we have, thank you. This is all about the boom and the bust, which is kind of the subtitle for my book. We are now in the middle of an extraordinary technological boom, and we're very close to an extraordinary catastrophic systems failure, which we could summarize with the bust. Okay, so the next slide. Now you can see this. Here's a remarkable picture, I guess taken by a drone or something, which in some ways captures the situation that we're in. We are rampaging through nature at the most devastating speeds. The Amazon rainforest, where that picture's taken from, Bolsonaro's just set a new record for deforestation. But we mustn't get carried away with the present. This has been going on since the 1950s. You know, I know that Trump has caught the headlines and Bolsonaro has caught the headlines for being clumsy populist leaders, but really, that's just a distraction. Human civilization is so technically advanced now. Our ability to invade nature and rip it up is absolutely unprecedented. And on top of that, we have a system which is promoting infinite growth on a finite planet, and it's just not possible. And we have a population which continues to grow. So we are on course, as you all probably know, for an extraordinary breakdown of ecosystems. And I think that picture just kind of captures it with great simplicity. Okay, next. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to tell you what the problem is. And it's very simple. In a way, it's just emissions. Well, I'll qualify that as I go along, but let's keep things simple for the moment. It's emissions, and the solution are laws. Again, that will be subject to some qualifications, but that's basically what my presentation is going to do. And I'll pause after the problem, and I'll pause after the solution for kind of short questions, and then we can have a dialogue about the details with Plato and his context or things like that. Okay, so that's my little plan. So does that make sense so far? Just pause there. I mean, I'm not sure how many people are on the call, but I guess you could raise your hand or something.
Yes, again, as I said, feel free to just raise your hand and unmute your mic when given the word, and also just drop any questions you might have on the chats. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go to the problems then. And I think this, in some ways, is kind of important, because I know that as a group in Warwick, this will probably be very well known to you, but maybe not everybody on the call, because we have some people from kind of all over the place. This may not be square in people's heads. And anyway, it's always good to just remind yourself of the basic facts, because they are extraordinary. We are really in a situation which is beyond absurd. So next slide. And again. Yep. Yeah. Sorry, I was going to talk about that, but I think maybe I'll just skip through it. Yeah, maybe we'll come back to that. Just go, because I've set myself to keep going down. Sorry, down. But just sorry, forward. Yep. Forward. And keep going forward to the end of that side. Yep. And again. And again. Okay, there you go. So that is some measurements of CO2 taken from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, and it's been measuring the level of concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere since 1956, and registered them since 58. And you can see that they've only gone up regularly. And so no matter how many solar panels you see, or recycling initiatives, or COP negotiations, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have only increased. You can see that on the right. It's not just CO2, it's also methane, nitrous oxide, and so on. So the hidden reality behind our boom is that we've racked up into the atmosphere this extraordinary extra thermal energy. Next, just click. And the consequence of that energy, sorry, no, the other way. The consequence of that energy, no, the other way. Yep. And back to the thermometer. So it's my fault, because my computer just decided to not cooperate. So there's a thermometer, and just to put that in perspective, the consequence of this thermal energy on ecosystems is as dramatic as an increase in 2 degrees would be on your body. So if you have a 2-degree temperature, you have watery eyes, you feel extremely unwell, you don't want to do anything, totally lethargic. Well, that's what 2 degrees as a metaphor would look like for the planet. So So 2 degrees in terms of like temperature for any one day, like a summer holiday, the difference between 24 and 26 is minimal. But the difference as a sustained average over a climate in an ecosystem is dramatic. And if you have a temperature of 4 degrees, that's technically known as hyperpyrexia. And that is a situation which your human body can't support for more than 24 hours. It's a medical emergency. And at the moment, if you add up all the emissions and all the promises made in COP 21, 22, 23, then at the moment we're still on course towards 4 degrees as a temperature. So we're talking about a systems collapse. Now, of course, if we had longer, we could talk about exactly what models are used and what pathways we might, but that's probably for another day. If you take the mainstream science and the main pathway where we're going, and if you don't include negative emissions, and if you don't include some very optimistic assumptions about technology, then we're on course for a catastrophe within your lifetime. Okay, next. So this is how weird it is. It's it's about 1 in 3 to 5 million year event. Okay, sometimes it's good just to put things in perspective. So human beings have had this extraordinary impact on planet Earth, and it's a game changer. It's a systems changer. Okay, and just a little quirk. If you just zoom in on the kind of big global perspective, the last 17,000 years was unusually stable. It's called the Holocene. It's really a bit of a kind of freak event. But that freakish geological feature made possible all of our economic ambitions, all of our development, all of our civilization. We've done it all inside a very amicable, a very amenable climate, quite a warm one. But it's a bit like having a computer plugged in. We just turned up the voltage to about 215 volts from 220. So we shouldn't expect to get away with it. Okay, next. And the other way. And just to make it really clear, go back. No, the other way. And again. Yep. So just finally, just to visualize it, we have built our civilization on the pink bits. We built our civilization on rivers and coastlines that were formed very recently. That's an image taken from 16,000 years ago, when sea levels were 120 meters lower. That's where we've done everything. We've assumed that all of that is there to stay, just like the Athenians would have assumed that their civilization would have been there to stay. They would have been the glorious Athenians for whatever. Well, here we built our civilization on those rocks, on that ground. We have our capital cities like Amsterdam and London built on rivers and coastlines that assume that nothing is going to change. But we have fundamentally changed it to extraordinary levels of CO2 and greenhouse gases. Okay, next. So just to quote a prop scientist, the science is clear, says Secretary Petari Talas. Without rapid cuts in CO2 and other greenhouse gases, climate change will have increasingly destructive and irreversible impacts on life on Earth. The window of opportunity for action is almost closed. The last time the Earth experienced a comparable concentration of CO2 was 3 to 5 million years ago, when the temperature was 2 to 3 degrees warmer and sea levels were 10 to 20 meters higher than now. Now, if you take a map of Europe and you just pump it up by 1 meter, it has an unbelievable effect. And well, Bangladesh also 60 centimeters, you're in serious trouble. So this is the cliff that human civilization is on. The stakes couldn't be higher. So if for any reason you've not understood why climate action is important and of existential importance, this makes it clear. It is not sustainable. And even if you slam the brakes on, Petari Taras there is talking about the current levels of CO2. So even if we just stopped breathing now and started extraordinary infrastructure developments and etc., and hardly had any more, then we would still have to draw down greenhouse gases from the atmosphere to avoid that. Now, of course, then you delay it by generations, but it is simply not compatible. At the moment, the status quo is not compatible with human civilization as it is now. And there's no way around it. This is just science. This is just basic physics, chemical reality. Okay? And I think it's important to ground that. Philosophy is grounded on empirical data. There's no point speculating rationally about anything if you don't get your facts right. Okay? And as students, especially younger students that I deal with at a high school level, getting the facts right and getting the science and the data clear is just basic. If you ever doubt yourself, like, why am I getting out of bed to do another action where nobody's listening to me, like in university or whatever, you have to come back to those basic truths. Okay? This is not sensible, and it's catastrophic. Okay. So this is just to visualize the different COP events, and now we're getting closer to Plato. We've had all kinds of initiatives and all kinds of green projects, but the sum result of everything that we have done so far, since we've known clearly about climate change, is that emissions have continued to rise. That's been the only consequence. So trying to continue with the same strategies that we've had in the past about individual actions or small local initiatives is not going to make it. And if you think it will make it, you have to look back at 30 years of action. It hasn't done it. Every single thing up to this point has shown that individual small-scale actions do not cut it. And this is Plato's point, that a society has to think at a systemic level. Climate change is a systemic issue. It's not an individual issue, it's a systemic issue. And that's why my conclusion in a minute that I'll start to explain, is that you've got to have systemic solutions. Okay, next. So just take a look at that. So this shows you that 82% of our energy demand is still covered by fossil fuel energy. 82%. People talk about a transition. There has been no transition. Green energies only fulfill the extra consumption that we demand with our extra overconsumption or the extra population. That has been the sum total of all our green energy. We still are 82% fossil fuel. That is not okay. So if you, I happened to listen to Radio 4 this morning as I was waking up, and there was a lady on there, some dame, somebody, and she was talking about how the UK has to improve its efforts. You know, this is going to be the year we're going to show the way. And at no point did she talk about systemic action. She only talked about individual action. Individual action cannot change the infrastructure of the energy system. It can't. We live in a structure which is doomed to fail because the system is drilled into fossil fuel energy. And unless our actions are determined to change that, then it's not going to work. So even if they say, for example, on the left there, you can see that wind and solar increased by 1,500%. Yeah, but 1,500% of what? 1,500% of a little bit is almost nothing. It's just an extra little bit of nothing. So the conclusion that we're going to come to with Plato is that we have to have systemic change for a systemic problem. Okay, next. Yeah, next. I've said my piece. Okay, so here's the solution. Now, I know in giving you this solution, I'm jumping over a whole load of psychology, a whole load of sociology, a whole load of, there's a whole load of stuff that I'm jumping over now. And that is what we will have as a discussion, okay? But just before I get to the solution, which is the law, are there any questions about the science of the situation that we're in? I can talk about modelling, if you like, or COP meetings, or whatever. I know it's a bit weird online to raise your hand for that.
I actually have a question then. Would you say that we're, for example, now with the solution, we're on track for more agreements, for example, with the new COP coming up, or do you think there's still work to do?
Yeah, I'm going to argue that the only solution is national laws, because COP is non-binding, and let's just run with it a little bit. Let's just give them a chance for a moment.
Oh, Alessio has a question. You can unmute yourself, Alessio.
Yeah, I just read an article the other day that I don't fully believe, and I was wondering if you believe it or not as well, Mr. Pai. It's on BBC. It says UN goals on climate change are within reach, new analysis shows. According to the UN Paris Climate Agreement, it's getting within reach. This could mean that the rise in world temperatures could lead to be held by maximum 2.1 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. Do you think that's a fact, or do you think that's just not the truth?
No. If you look at that article where it points 2.1 and just scroll down a little bit on the page, you'll see that in the graph, emissions still increase up to about 2030.
Yeah.
And then they bend them down.
But it's based on false predictions of where it's going, no?
Well, I think the main false prediction in that sense is the negative emissions, and there'll also be different modelling things inside. Now, it is true that we just had 1 year in which we had slightly less. Well, they reckon about 8% less emissions because of COVID. But that doesn't take into account the fact that there was a monumental amount of forest fires. But let's not get distracted by short-term things. Essentially, we'll come to it in the solution. I'll explain, put 11%. The data is refreshed every year. And that data is based on a consistent, highly reliable data set. The BBC always, the very, very, very few websites, the BBC included, that have an honest representation of where we are. The main reason for that is assumptions about negative emissions. But the details are explained actually in the book, and I'm sure Michael and Birgit, they're real experts on all those sorts of modelling things. Those would be the headline answers to that. Just as perhaps as a final point, all models work on a 66% probability as well. So it is possible that our modelling is out, maybe, and we've been too pessimistic. It's also possible that we've been too optimistic. And they're always tinkering with these models, but the core science is extremely stable around that model.
Okay, thanks again. If anyone has any questions, just raise your hand. If not, we'd love to hear about the solutions.
Yeah. Okay, so my proposed solution, well, not it's Michael and Birgit's insight backed up by Plato, is that the law is the only way in which we can move forward in a systemic way. So I'll just take you through that. Next slide. So we have a project based on the data from the Homo sapiens Foundation, like I said, which is updated every year, and it's called cut 11%. So not just cut emissions, which is often said in the streets, cut emissions now. Well, that's great, but by how much? Greta has given us the words. We have to congratulate and thank Greta Thunberg for being so outspoken with the language and shifting the language of climate change towards the right kind of vocabulary about collapse and system failure and catastrophe. So that's great, but we don't yet have a demand for a specific demand about how much we have to cut. It's far too general. So let's just go next. So if you go on the website cut11%.eu, you can see there, and I think the link is in the web thing, there is a reduction for every country and what its fair responsibility is for reaching both the 1.5 degree target or the 2 degree target. So the Paris Agreement has committed all the nations of the world to the objective of stabilizing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at a safe level. And there you can see on the right-hand side what that means in terms of a national effort. So for the UK, for 2 degrees, the UK has to reduce its emissions by 6.9% per year, every year from now. So I should from now. And for 1.5 degrees, it would have to reduce emissions by 28. My glasses are a bit, so you can see there that to achieve 1.5 degrees is, I'm not going to say impossible, but those who are asking for 1.5, they have to be very honest about what they're asking for. It would mean essentially that the United States would be carbon neutral in about 18 months. Now, with the best will in the world, and Joe Biden is, of course, a bit better than Trump, but it's still a long way off. So 1.5 degrees, I'm not saying we don't fight for that, because you can still draw down greenhouse gases once they're up there. But even the 2 degree target is quite ambitious. So we're already into a quite a heavy minefield of actions. And of course, the further you go over 2 degrees, the more you risk entering into different tipping points and triggering nature to just run away with itself, where any human action just becomes futile. So just to go back to the numbers, China, notice its figures are perhaps lower than maybe what you expected, but that's because China, first of all, has a huge population, and it seems only fair that we divide emissions by per capita, so per person. There's one atmosphere above our heads, so that's only fair. And China is generally quite busy making all of our stuff. So laptop, the phone that I'm looking at now, the laptop maybe that you're looking at, perhaps that was made in China. Well, the responsibility for that emissions is with the consumer. Okay, you could have a debate about Chinese responsibility in terms of how they make these products, but it seems only fair to, as a starting point, to have them based in consumption. And you can see at the bottom, the other thing to pick out from this summary here, this is just a sample of countries, is that the least developed countries, the poorest countries, who will suffer the most because they're less equipped to deal with climate change, they are contributing the least to the problem. So this really is a problem which the developed world has to face up to. And it's got the technology, it's got the wealth, it's got all of that resource to be able to handle it. So just to back up the science, because I know you spoke with Michael and Birgit, but all this data has been approved at the highest level of science. And Kevin Anderson there on the left, he's the global authority on the carbon budget. And he's endorsed these figures on the website. You can see his little video. And we had a day with him where the students talked through all of these numbers with him and explained the rationale for it, and he agreed with its validity. So that's the project. So if you go on the website, you see there's a data set for every single country. Are there any questions about that? Because that's kind of key to what I'm going to say next about laws. Maybe just pause there with that table. The other thing on the left is the resource consumption. Emissions don't just come out of nowhere. It's all driven by our consumption, resource extraction. That's the root of the problem. The root of the problem is we have a society that's just driven by growth and extraction. And of course, the good news is that these things don't make us happier. So we can afford to not do it. But that requires us to be brave in our political discourse and at our community level with what really matters. So yeah.
Just to add something, if you really want to see the numbers and get more information on your particular country, for example, I just sent the link on the group chat, so you can add it.
Yeah, thanks. And I think what's important to stress is that at the UN level, going back to your question, Carolina, about COP meetings, COP is working its way slowly towards better agreements, but they're not based on reality. The starting point of COP negotiations is not really the carbon budget and how to divide it fairly. Now, take the EU, for example. The EU's 2030, 2040, 2050 targets are all based on political ideas. It's nothing to do with a carbon budget. So when they make a promise of 50% up to 60%, and they're pushing for 65 and so on in the Green Deal, etc. Well, great, but it doesn't inform you about what that does to the carbon budget overall. So what we don't have is kind of extraordinary. We don't have an index, a clear index for emissions reductions. It's not really obvious where we're up to. Are we close to 2 degrees? Are we close to 1.5? So we have indexes for COVID. We have that R number. We have indexes for inflation. We have public accountability for inflation. Like in the UK, the Bank of England has to keep it at a certain level. It has levers to sustain it at that level. And it has to write to the Prime Minister if it goes up or below that level. And then the media asks them, why is inflation too low? Why is inflation too high? But there's a basic index. We don't have an index for climate change. And that is just shocking. Just basic principle of common sense. You want to deal with the problem. Well, first, what's the budget that's left? And then the next question is, well, okay, if we divide it per capita, what then? Now, that is what is missing. And until that really happens, you're going to get flapping interviews with politicians where they say, well, we did a bit more green energy. We're going to go with lots of ambition to Glasgow, etc. Well, what does it all mean? Well, the numbers are not there to hold people to account. So until the climate action, until we go on the streets with some kind of, or onto radio and on the streets with some kind of numbers, then we're not going to get any traction. I'm not saying that we have to just go onto the streets with numbers, because of course everybody comes to the climate crisis with their own individual priorities and interests and perspectives, because the system has to budge at every level in terms of agriculture, in terms of banking and divestment, and so on and so on and so on. So everybody should go on the streets with a banner for their own interest, but they should also go with a number. So every nation here has got a number, which its nation should face up to.
Trey.
Is that a question? Bubbling up?
Well, if you have any questions, unmute your mic. If not, just so there isn't any background noise, could you mute yourselves?
I've been struggling online teaching for weeks now. I'm kind of used to it. what's really sad for me is that nobody laughs at my jokes anymore. I mean, I know that they didn't always laugh at my jokes in class, but still now people have to unmute their microphones to laugh at my jokes, and then that's just not. Anyway, I'm feeling all kind of lonely. Right, let's go to the next slide. Enough about my classroom troubles. Yeah, okay. So we can have a dialogue here where we can ask the kind of middle questions. I think that philosophy, because it is a holistic subject and it enables you to see the whole picture, it's all about science, economics, history, hysteria, politics, and psychology, you name it. Philosophy is called the queen of all subjects. So it gives us this vantage point to look down and see the big picture. And that's, in a way, what I've done there. That's like the job of the philosopher, to pose questions, to juxtapose things, and to put forward a starting point for dialogue. Now, that is how Plato's dialogues work as well. That's how his books are a conversation, a deep conversation, a dialogue between different characters. So I'll just set up give you some details. I've just got a couple of slides to finish. Just click one more time. So Plato offers us this extra detail. The reason that I gave you the ideal of having these laws in place is because Plato's vision of an ideal society in his book, The Republic, was that it would be a totalitarian state, a totalitarian state with philosophers in charge. Now, of course, now you're getting nervous, but it's not so bad, because these philosophers are not like Stalin or Mao. They're dedicated to beauty and truth. They don't own property. And it's a bit like here what we've just done with the climate crisis. It takes a rational view of the world. So the philosopher kings in Plato's Republic were there to just ask the questions and to frame the Athenian state, or the ideal state, with rational laws. So, I mean, this is as simple as saying you should not be able in any state to produce toxic pizzas. So we'll have a law for that. You should not in this state be able to have schools that have gas leaks and kill hundreds of children. So we'll have laws about gas leaks. Well, it's a bit the same principle. We have a planet and we have a big gas leak, so we should have a law about that. What is a safe limit for this gas? Okay, so there's nothing spooky about these philosopher kings. Plato's been kind of castigated through history for kind of promoting or being responsible for Hitler and Stalin and so on. Now, okay, on an abstract level, if you forget about 900 things about Plato, then okay, but that's simply what Plato's about. And these philosopher kings would look after the army, and they would look after the workers. So just click one more time. And the dialogue itself, the Republic, is set in a place called Piraeus, not Athens per se, but the harbour area. And what I've done here with the image is I've copy-pasted over the top a more detailed view of the Piraeus. So the Piraeus is the harbour of Athens. And if you look carefully, you can see that there's kind of almost like 5th Avenue, 6th Avenue, New York lines for the streets, because the Piraeus was actually the first example in human history of a planned city. A guy called Hippodamus designed it before they built it. And Plato sets up the dialogue in the Republic, and not in the center of Athens, not in front of the Agora. He does it in the Piraeus. And in the book that I've written, there's a whole section for several pages about the symbolism of that. But just for today, just very briefly, the point is that the Greeks were the world's first in doing all kinds of things, but they were especially, this is one very good example of that, That's what Plato's doing. He's saying, look, if you want to build a sustainable city, a sustainable society, you have to think about it in advance. You can't just have your society run by desires, run by short-term ambitions. You have to take a bird's eye view of things. So that's one of the key reasons why the dialogue which Plato has in the book is set there. Okay. And then my final slide. So in many ways, this is just, if we just ignore the spirit and the army for a moment, the main dialogue here is between reason and the appetites. That we have an economy that's driven by consumption, is driven by political will just to get re-elected. Democracies are wired into our desires and into consumption. That's how they function. That's their operating system. Now, I'm not here to sort of say I'm not here to say we should get rid of democracies. But we have to recognize that democracies, the way in which they're set up is that they reward the desires and they don't reward long-term rational planning. And we have to allow Plato to interrogate us about that. We can't just say, well, democracy is good, blah, 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 and just get on with things. We can't just say GDP is good and just get on. We have to allow, that's the job of a philosopher, is to confront us, just like where I started in the presentation. Philosophers are there to confront us about the world and make us ask the big questions and face up to reality. And if we don't do that, then reality will do it for us. So going back to that triangle where we started, our everyday life will be crashed into by climate change if we don't think about it in advance. Okay, there you go. I think that's it. Anyway, I'll stop there. I think there was a couple of hands.
Yes, there are. So I think Anna has her hand up. If you could just unmute yourself and ask the question.
I've had a bunch of theories about climate change, and I've watched a bunch of videos on YouTube, and this one particular one about geoengineering, of how to physically stop other than planting trees. And one of them was stratosphere aerosol injection, which you would take a lot of planes and fill them up with a particular gas, and every once a year you would fly up, fill the atmosphere with this gas that would stop the sunlight reaching all the way down to the earth. Now, even though there's a bunch of side effects that would really destroy the planet unless we did the right thing. So, for example, even though you're cooling down the part under these gases, the part over it will heat up very fast, much faster than the other one, the lower one. So what it would give us a chance to really use it and plant trees and stop all this badness. But the thing is, politicians might use it as an excuse to keep going and, well, using emissions.
Yeah.
So do you think that could work?
Yeah, I think the problem is that already the models are complex and we're playing dice. As you rightly say, I mean, I think reading between the lines of what you're saying, I think I agree with you, that this is an extraordinary gamble. And what you're not doing is you're not relieving the pressure under the system. You know, carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for thousands of years. If you don't take that away, if you don't draw it down with technology or trees, but careful with trees because there's not much land left to put enough trees in. Birgit and Michael have got some great statistics for that. But yeah, the fundamental problem is overpopulation and overconsumption. So this is just a way of masking the problem, not really dealing with it. But of course, as a final solution, as a gesture, I mean, I tentatively, you have to think of everything. But to even relax your thinking about just getting emissions down, I think I would be against it in principle, just because it doesn't solve the problem and it delays it for another generation, or it even. I'll just give you a little example of how we don't know really what we're doing. When there was a hole in the ozone layer, we suddenly understood that CFCs were the cause of the hole in the ozone layer. They realized that humanity had lucked out because they chose CFCs. They could have chosen BFCs, which is a slightly different chemical. There was no real reason why we went for CFCs, not BFCs. But if we would have gone for the B and not the C, then the ozone layer would have been depleted at such an extraordinary, so much more potent, that there would have been no time to realize the problem and then rectify it. So we looked out with CFCs. In fact, the guy that got the Nobel Prize for the research on the ozone layer is actually now a major name in climate change. I think his response to your point would be that this is a huge chemical gamble, and you don't want to just keep mixing the cocktail. You just want to get the CO2 out of the atmosphere. Good, nice question.
So I think Louisa has a question. Could you unmute yourself?
Hi, so I'm not actually Louisa, but I do have a question. So my question is more about this notion of democracy and the way that these laws can be implemented within our contemporary notion of liberal democracies. Because I think a lot of democracy theorists would agree with me when we say that a main challenge to the working and sort of the welfare of democracy as we know today is the fact that it cannot fundamentally prescribe and implement radical change. And so to that extent, I want to ask, how is it possible that within the fundamental notion of creation of laws, we can implement them without to some extent steering away from democracy, especially in the way that Plato imagined it, but also in the way that our current system of liberal democracies sees it.
Yeah, excellent. When I started writing the book 5 years ago, there were other chapters with other philosophers, but there was no hope then of any democratic change whatsoever. Greta Thunberg was in primary school, so let's just first say that it is envisageable now with about the same, if the momentum carries on but goes even tighter and more assertive, then these laws could be agreed through a democratic system. But I still think that's very ambitious. But just to say that it would have been unimaginable where we are now just a few years ago. And we haven't dealt with emissions, but the public perception has changed. So let's just keep that door open. The second thing I'd say is that Macron had tried citizens assemblies. That's another way of, in a way, short-circuiting democracy, but having it. But I'm sure you're aware at university, if you do, it sounds like you're studying political philosophy or something like that. These things also have their limitations, especially because they tend to just say, "Well, I think what the expert thinks," or something. I mean, and these things are so complex that's full of problems. The other possibility is legal courts. So Plan B, one of the Climate Academy members, Sebastian Kay, from a few years ago, he was involved in the Plan B action. So that's another way of the courts of law are a democratic institution to protect human rights. So I can hear what you're saying about how it's not feasible in some ways to just have these platonic diktats coming down and squashing people, but sometimes law courts do that. They say uncomfortable things. It's so, and law courts are democratic. It's the wider democracy. And at the end of all this, I mean, those are kind of avenues, I think. I'm not in any kind of omniscient position to be able to point the finger at any one of those three things. But the final thing to say, I suppose, for myself is that this is so extraordinarily stupid, the situation that we're in. I can't believe that reasonable people, if they were presented with the truth, would object to limiting laws for emissions. And so therefore it's a question of education. So that's why I wrote a book, and that's why I do talks, and this is so simple and it's so absurd that it's not happening. So yeah, I don't have a happy answer, and of course World War I shows us that human beings are capable of self-destruction, and in some ways you could look at the current situation and just think, yeah, the mechanisms, the cogs of change just can't turn fast enough. People leading up to World War I could see the catastrophe coming, but in a way couldn't fix it because the alliance system was so entrenched and so on. So I know we're up against steep challenges, but human beings have overcome them before, and let's go down trying. But you're right, there is a tremendous conflict in that way between the notion of law and the notion of, let's call it unenlightened democracy. What do you think?
Sorry, what do I think?
Yeah.
I think that all these sort of aisles that you enumerated all fall back into sort of this deviation from liberal democracy. So say the idea of citizen assemblies, that's no longer a form of representative democracy, it's a form of deliberative democracy. The idea of a law court as the sort of supreme power in discussing national policies, that is no longer representative democracy, that's a form of technocracy or even epistocracy. And so I feel like what we're dealing with is not necessarily even the law-making body as sort of the supreme savior, let's say, but the notion that we live in a democracy that is fundamentally consistent of economic ideals. The idea that our democracy is built on sort of Schumpeterian dogma of economic growth as a consequence of, say, democratic innovation. And I think as long as we have what you've called sort of this uninformed democracy, so long as there's an issue with education and the ability of sort of rational and open thought, we'll continue following down into this line of thinking that linear growth and linear history and progress are the only ways that democracy can function.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of tragic. I mean, this is the one. Actually, just maybe it's a good time. There's the slide I skipped over. Just go. Can you just scroll back to the very beginning? Part of me agrees with you that maybe it's just not possible. You know, that's it. Yeah, just pause there. I don't know if that's why I put in as one of the questions: is democracy compatible with exiting climate change? I don't know. And of course, we haven't even started talking about capitalism. I mean, so here's just an interesting thing about the Greeks and their wisdom and their insight. We probably all know the story of the Trojan Wars and the fact that the Achaeans left the Trojan horse outside the walls, and then it was dragged in, and all the soldiers came out, and then they attacked the city, and they won, etc. But what's less known is that there was a woman at the time who was screaming the alarm, and she was called Cassandra, and she knew what was inside the horse, and she knew what was going to happen next. And the reason that she knew that was because she'd made a pact with the god Apollo The god Apollo rather fancied Cassandra. He thought she was rather beautiful, and he offered her the gift of prophecy, the gift of seeing the future, if she would give him a cuddle. Of course, a little bit more than a cuddle, at least 3 or 4. At the last minute, she reneged on the deal, and he didn't then get rid of the gift of prophecy. She could keep it, but the twist was that nobody would believe her. And so, actually, later on in the story, she actually foresees her own death, of course, before it happens. But this is sort of the situation we're in now with democracy. You know, if you see the graphs for greenhouse gas emissions, and you look at the political will that's out there and the democratic awareness, a scientist feels like Cassandra. Or, you know, anybody who's looked at those science graphs, there's this kind of extraordinary Kafkaesque feeling like, what, really? This is crazy. Stop dragging the horse in. And I just, you know, the Greeks were extraordinary in their wisdom and insight into the human condition. And yeah, this poses questions about democracy, and it poses questions about civil disobedience. That's why you have top scientists gluing themselves to buildings. So yeah, I don't know, but if we just one last click, and then we'll go back to questions. Because if you bring up the 2 faces on the side there, the greatest tradition in Athenian society, the kind of the big cultural highlight, a bit like the Oscars, if you like we have a cinematic culture, was the tragedy, the Greek tragedy. But there were 2 thinkers who were different, and one of them was Aristophanes, and the other was Plato. And they had an optimistic view of the human self. They thought that reason could overcome stuff. So Aristophanes, in his comedies, had a broadly upward trajectory. It was kind of idealistic, if you like. And the same with Plato. Plato's myth of the cave, the simile of the cave, it's about how humans can exit the cave. But of course, we know the end of the cave simile, that he goes back down to tell the others, and in democracy, and he gets beaten up. And that's the other thing that Aristophanes and Plato share, is that they're both anti-democratic. So there you go.
Well, thank you. I think there's still a question from Alessio. Alessio, could you ask it?
Yeah, so it's kind of similar to Lucia's point. So it's clear we need systemic change, right? But for that we need action. And I feel like proper action, sure, there have been strikes and everything like that, and it's looking good, it's looking better, progress is definitely there. But I feel like we are at a stage where we only have public perception or public awareness, whatever you want to call it, but we don't have actual desire to change. So Plato talks about the mind and the body. It's kind of a good metaphor of saying the mind, it kind of knows the truth about climate change. We all, I mean, hopefully at this point, we're all aware about climate change. We all should, know the consequences, know the facts, know the maths, know the everything. But however, the body is what let us down. The senses, what we actually do in the world, is kind of letting us down. Like basically, I had this in a lecture the other day, and it's kind of like what you do, you will accept the facts, but then you'll go and buy a plane ticket all across the world, and you'll go and fund these major corporations, and sure, it's on an individual level, but if each individual is not pushing legislation and is not, collectively pushing for systematic action, then I don't know if it's possible to achieve something with these perceptions in mind. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think, and this is in the book. In the book, there's 2 bits to the solution, and the first bit is laws. So I've outlined that for you. But the second bit is virtues, values, and that's what has to pull it. Plato understood there was a kind of standoff between the rational mind and the body. The rational mind, in a way, is just this cold, analytical computer, if you like, and the body is this chaotic, impulsive creature. But Plato, for the first time, divides the self into three. There's a threefold division of the self in Plato, and the middle self is the spirit, thumos. And what he does, Plato, is that he takes the Greek tragedy, the Greek Homer idea of thumos as a kind of battlefield courage, wrapped up in all those kind of great bare-chested Spartan movies you could watch, and he makes it civic. He puts those kind of that pride into a civic context. So the threefold division of the self in Plato has got thumos in the middle, and that should be the mobilizing force. That's what people have to be brave about. And I think to envisage that, the example I give in the book is Martin Luther King. The civil rights movement demanded balls. It demanded guts. It demanded people to risk their life. It demanded people to keep a steady course, a clear view of the direction they were going. And what did Martin Luther King argue for? Laws. He argued for the civil rights. He got the Civil Rights Act, and he didn't stop before he got that. And he had to demonstrate tremendous courage to do that. And okay, he had a background in Protestant religion, which gave him the vocabulary of values, and he spoke in biblical language and biblical rhetoric to inspire people to do it. And in a way, that's, I think, what we have to have now. We have to have a public discourse which is bold and courageous about laws, driven by this notion of virtues. Because it's too simplistic to say that we're just mind and body. That we're just kind of, we just want to eat pizza. There's more to us than that. And that's been, in a way, denied a lot in capitalist culture. I mean, this is a bit of a crass overstatement now, but there's a bit of us, this thumos, this middle self, this spirit, which recognizes something bigger and deeper. But it's not been given air yet in terms of climate change. The climate change movement in general has sort of either come across as idealistic, or come across as legalistic, or come across as a bit hippie, or come across as a little bit kind of Stalinist or something like that. I mean, some of those have been caricatures created by the media, of course, who want to squash it. But we have to find now a vocabulary and an approach to the problem which recognizes that we are creatures, we are human beings with values, and those are things that resonate with us. When we go to the movies and we cry, that's what moves us. We're capable of being moved, and we just have to somehow have cleverer narratives, braver narratives. So I shouldn't say clever. We have to have braver narratives. That's why in the front of the book it says Plato, but crossed out is courage. Courage tackles climate change. Fundamentally, that's what we need now.
Okay, thanks. Cool.
Okay, I think Anna has another question. Also, if you guys don't want to unmute your mics, just write them down. It's okay, I can read them out. Thanks.
Hi, thank you very much for the discussion, and nice to meet you, Mr. Pai. I'm a parent from school in Brussels. It's not a question, it's perhaps would be a valuable continuation, information to continue your discussion, and for all the participants. Every year I try to go to Strasbourg to World Forum for Democracy, organized by Council of Europe. And this year, interestingly enough, the topic was, can democracy save the environment? So I wanted to invite the participants to Google and log in and perhaps to follow some of the online discussions, and also to Google their campaign called 12 Months, One Question, on this topic that will end in November next year with the same question: can democracy save the environment? So I hope all the people who care can contribute and engage in this initiative. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. All those voices are so important. All those every piece of the jigsaw really matters. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, if anybody has any questions, I think Ahisma has a question. Yes.
Yes, hi, I'm Sanjay. I'm just here with the profile of my daughter Himsa. Thank you, Matthew Pye, for this talk. I just wanted to ask, are you going to make this recording available so we can distribute it further?
Yes, I will.
Yes, okay.
All right. Thanks. I mean, if it's okay for everyone, of course.
I'll just mention that the book, we have a little, it feels so kind of peculiar to do a kind of commercial thing now, because this is so much not about commercial stuff, but it's all about education. But just as a kind of gesture, the book is for sale on Amazon and on bol.com, that's a Dutch, Belgian website. And if you use the code, my dad's posted in the thing at code, and you can get it for a reduced price for Christmas. If you order it using that code. So it's normally €20, £20, €20, and it's down to 15, 16. So all the gaps and all the little mistakes I might have said, or unqualified statements, there's 85,000 words of qualification inside that book with some nice pictures. And I should actually mention that the cartoons, I've skipped past, can we just go, but I just want to mention my friend Carl, because he could be on the call as well. Carl, are you on the call, Carl?
I don't think so. Oh, yes.
You are? Hey. Well, just if you go, down, there's Carl, a remarkable young man, gentleman, I should say. Keep going. And all the cartoons in the book were designed and conceived and done by Carl. And maybe it's a good place to finish. That's it. The problem that we have, and in a way that's embodied by democracy, is that we're sensory creatures, and climate change fundamentally is abstract. And the way in which we do initiatives and everything, like with recycling or waste, and in the school that I'm in, we're doing well with climate change, and we have but still, the center of gravity is always towards tiny little gestures about recycling or something. So there's Carl's cartoon to sum it up. So we have the polar bear on the right with all the flowers and the flames, and just, by the way, millions of deaths, the extinction of the economy and entire ecosystems. Just the kind of irony of the situation we're in at the moment, wonderfully captured by Carl's cartoons. So there's lots of cartoons in the book as well that Carl so wisely drew.
Thanks, Carl. This is very...
To everyone, it's a good book, very informative. Thanks, Matthew.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Well, sorry if we have time for one last question. I guess, Elzbieta, would you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. So I was just talking to a friend about sort of this mention of consumption, and sort of invigorated our conversation about the notion of corporations and corporate responsibility, assuming that these are sort of entities that fuel our consumption and that thus degenerate the environment. So my question would be, how can we imagine sort of the solutions towards climate change, seeing as we do live in a society, especially in Western Europe, that's fueled by sort of corporate attempts to infuse the sort of notion of responsibility, whilst in reality, it's basically just marketing. And this idea that a lot of the policies that we see and a lot of the control over the policies that do occur in whether it be law courts or politics happen as a consequence of lobbyism that obviously also occurs as a consequence of the monopoly in political power that these corporations hold, especially seeing as those corporations are globalized entities that work in a majority of, say, areas, whereas national governments are really just responsible for national welfare. So then my question would be, how is it possible to sort of solve this problem, or to sort of redistribute the power within democracy of these corporate elites that we see today?
Good question, Elżbieta. Of course, I don't have the answer, but I think that one of the ways in which you can short-circuit it is by having some kind of democratic control on elections and how they're funded. I think that's something that has to become an urgent part of democratic debate. Media, social media, media in general, creates the superstructure within which we think, like the matrix within which we think about all of this. And if you have a big business and media tied up together that then can influence elections so dominantly, I think that's one of the major bits in the chain that we have to think about. Other than that, you're right. I don't know. We live with global problems and we only have national legislation. That's why, in some ways, I think we have to use what we have. I come back to the 11% principle. That if we can get national laws through, that will change the global atmosphere. But you're right. It's a monumental challenge. So let's concentrate our energies where we can do it. So that's on the streets with climate action, and in the courts, with laws, national laws. It's too good a question.
Matthew?
Well, thank you so much.
Matthew?
If it's okay for you, could you just take a screenshot of the call? Is that okay? If somebody can wait, sorry.
Can you hear
There's
me, Matthew?
A question.
Can you hear me?
Oh, there's another question.
My microphone's muted, is it?
Is that a hand
Oh,
from
Hello.
Wow.
Yep. Just a comment on Matthew's discount price on his book. You can't. It won't work through Amazon or Bol. You have to send Matthew an email requesting it at that price. He inferred it was a discount token. Just send him an email saying you like it at the cheap price. You don't go on Bol or Amazon to get it. Okay.
That's the original.
Hi, the original. Yeah.
Thanks, Dad.
All right. Well done.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the presentation and a very insightful discussion. I hope everyone took something from the discussion and thinks about it for the next, well, I'd say material for next week's. And if you have any further questions, feel free to text, Insta, direct message, anything from Messenger to Climate to Reality Warwick chapter, and you can link it to other sources of information. And yeah, thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Matthew, for being here. Yes, I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Carolina. Of course, in the book, there's your essay as well. Remarkable.
Yeah.
Well done.
Well, thanks everyone. I hope you have a nice weekend.
Okay.